Man, you ever just come across a dead horse and feel the need to beat it? Greetings, friends, and mostly enemies. Continuing on with the world building, I'm not done, and you aren't either. Class is in session, so grab your notebook, grab your calculator, and let's do you some learning. And don't mind my addiction in... There we go. In the background. It's not a paid advertisement. I just have a problem. So, physics engines, magic systems, and how they interact with your physical world, and their ramifications. That's the subject for today's video. We're going to do two examples, one for a physics engine, and one for a magic system, both very rough, very rudimentary and basic, but we're going to give them, and we're going to talk a little about the examples to give you an idea, because one of the primary ways I learn is through examples. If I'm given enough examples and I can put together a pattern between them and extract the core principles that's running through every example, I get concepts much better. And so that's how I learn, and so maybe that's how you learn, and that's probably why you're here if that's how you learn. So we're going to run through these examples, and then after both examples, I'm going to give you my basically checklist on how to implement a physics engine and a magic system. So without further ado, let's hit it. So it goes without saying, or at least it should, that the rules that your world runs on, the world building in terms of the physics and the magic system, are critical. They set stakes. They set expectations. They let the reader know what can and cannot happen, what should and shouldn't happen, and that makes the story more interesting because it sets up barriers and obstacles that your characters have to overcome that the story has to find a way around. And when you have really good world building and you find a way around it, it looks clever and well done, and it feels very exciting. When you have half-assed world building that your characters never need to work around, or you just ignore your own world building and your characters just navigate through every potential obstacle that the world should be presenting effortlessly, it feels like a bunch of Mary Sue bullshit. So we don't do either of those. We need to have concrete rules that our characters have to follow. In most stories, death is a concrete rule. That's just as an example. You die, that's it. You're dead. That's the vast majority of stories out there. Obviously not all, both in science fiction and fantasy. There's plenty of characters that get brought back to life one way or another. But in a good chunk of stories, I'd say over 50%, death is a hard fast. So that's one example of how world building and adhering to your rules sets stakes. If death, just as an example, if death is a hard stake, then we know if a character dies, well, that's it. That's a consequence. That's something that they should have tried to avoid more, and they didn't. And it elevates the story and propels the story forward and presents obstacles for other characters. That's the kind of hard, fast rules you need in your world, and you need to adhere to them, whatever they are. You can bend your rules. Harry Dresden loves bending the rules of his world, but you can't break them. No matter how hard your characters try, they shouldn't be able to flat out break the rules of your world. Because the second the rules of your world break, that's when your world loses credibility. That's when plot holes open up, that's when continuity breaks down, and that's when nothing truly makes sense anymore. Rules are there for a reason. I can't beat that dead horse enough. Now, something that helps me when I'm thinking of how I'm designing my world's rules is, what are the principles of that world? What are some of the core tenets of the changes I'm making? What makes this world different? What is fundamental in the physics engine and magic system of this world? So, here's an example. I'm going to give you some criteria for a new world, and then after the criteria, we're going to run through some of the changes that have to be made to everything else to facilitate these physics and what these physics are going to do, and we're going to talk about the core principles behind these physics. So let's say we give a planet 0.8 Earth gravity. So that means 100 pounds here on Earth would be 80 pounds on this planet. 0.8 Earth gravity. Then we're going to up the oxygen supply in livable areas to 35%. Then let's add a gas to the atmosphere that's mildly neurotoxic, that causes mild hallucinations and paranoia. And let's say it crystallizes under pressure about 1.1 atmospheres and 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Under those conditions, it will naturally crystallize, whether it's in caves or underwater. And finally, just for shits and giggles, let's give this world a big-ass moon that's 1.5 times the size of Earth's moon. That's going to give us really interesting interactions with tidal and water activity when we also factor in this planet's low gravity. Massive tidal waves, folks. So there's the physics. So now that you had your physics engine in place, you would affect your physical world in every way it was supposed to be affected by that physics engine. So let's say you have mountains on your planet, okay? They'd probably be taller than you initially expected if it was less than Earth gravity, because gravity isn't going to be acting so hard on the rock structures, pulling them down. Freezing and cracks in the rocks aren't going to break them up as readily, because even if they're full of cracks and now structurally unsound, they're not being pulled down as hard. So mountains are probably going to be taller and stay taller for longer. That's one thing. The other thing, of course, is that our animals are going to be affected by this neurotoxin, and our fauna are definitely going to be affected by that higher oxygen level. Oxygen level and availability in the atmosphere is one of the primary things that has affected the evolution of animals and insects on this planet. And if we had 35% oxygen in the air right now, bugs would be huge. Huge. So with those things in mind, obviously these physics present some unique challenges to any protagonists we have in this story. We're going to be dealing with easily broken bones, because lighter gravity means your bones don't form as dense. We're going to be dealing with the mental health symptoms from that neurotoxic gas I mentioned. Probably an important plot point of your story would be either the cure for this gas or the treatment, or a search for a cure or treatment. Due to that increased oxygen in the atmosphere, fires are going to be a much bigger concern. Fire in 35% oxygen would spread like you wouldn't believe. Everything would catch fire. I don't know if you know this, but even steel wool will burn under a oxygen-rich environment. You take a lighter and you take some pure oxygen and you try to ignite steel wool, you'll burn steel wool. It's that ridiculous. So high oxygen environments are no joke. Another possible ramification is with these superbugs on this planet. It's very likely that some of them would begin hunting humans. I mean, it's entirely within the realm of possibility. There's bugs right now that hunt things that are way bigger than them, tarantulas that hunt birds. It's entirely reasonable that in a 35% oxygen atmosphere, we'd have bugs big enough to potentially take a crack at humans. And then finally, another possible impact of this world's physics and changes is because of that low gravity and that big moon, we're going to have ridiculous tidal activity, like I said, so sailing would likely be an extremely risky proposition, and any life on any kind of ocean front or Great Lake front property would be precarious, potentially. On the flip side, some advantages we would now have to consider. Our humans would have superhuman-like stamina. That low gravity and that increased oxygen, you could probably sprint indefinitely. And I mean that light reduction in weight, but that vastly improved oxygen supply, just a little bit of training, and you'd be able to sprint for ridiculous periods of time. If not a full-blown sprint, certainly a good, solid marathon pace indefinitely. I mean, like, the need for sleep and food stopping you before the need to stop stopping you. Okay, that's the kind of stamina boost we're talking about. with these physics in place. And of course, with that neurotoxin in play, we can have all kinds of interesting interactions with our protagonists. We could maybe say that it affects certain parts of the population differently, gives them psychic abilities, or increases their intelligence to absurd levels, or increases their senses to absurd levels, superhuman levels. You could really play around with that toxin and have fun with that. So that's the rules of our hypothetical world and some of the ramifications. And in this world, the core principles would be the gravity, the atmospheric changes, and that moon. Okay, those would be the three core principle changes that we really needed to focus on and run through all the logical conclusions, thought processes, all that stuff, so that we really nailed down all the impacts those changes would have, and we were very consistent with those changes. Something you might not think about is with that different atmosphere, sound is going to travel differently. Light is going to appear differently. Colors are going to change because atmospheric composition affects the perception of light a great deal. So these are all things you need to think about. These are all things that if you write about them and you give them even just a couple lines of attention scattered throughout the book, it really adds in that crisp level of detail, that cherry on top level of detail that makes the world building feel really fleshed out, that feels really thought out. And readers love that shit. They love it when it's subtle but complete world building. But let's switch gears. Let's say this is a fantasy setting, not a sci-fi setting. So we're going to have a magic system in place. All right, cool. So let's have a hypothetical race that's capable of using magic, okay? We'll call them the Z. And we'll say that the magic system is based entirely on the manipulation and the potential of energy. So with this simple magic system, we're going to have a few things immediately that we know they can do. They're going to be able to bend light. They're going to be able to create ice and fire and lightning. They're going to be able to likely have a great impact, if not outright control the weather. They're going to be able to control things like inertia and momentum, kinetic energy. And they'd likely be able, in extreme circumstances, to create atomic explosions if they could get access to any fissible material. So obviously a very simple but powerful magic system. Now obviously, any magic system that's worth its salt needs some kind of limiting factor, either through the way the plot is designed or through rules you directly place on the magic system. So let's say the rules we place on this magic system are they can't directly interact with mass. They can't directly interact with the physical properties of any material except through adding or subtracting or altering energy in the material. So that would be adding heat, etc., etc. So clearly, the core principle of this magic system is energy physics. And we could find out everything we needed to know about how this magic system behaved, what its limits were, and what these Z would be able to do with it by simply studying energy physics. And that's obviously super easy. You can Google that subject till the day ends and not be done with it. You could get textbooks up the wazoo and go to the store and get Physics 101 for Dummies, and there's plenty of educational material out there to help you flesh out a magic system like that. So there would be no reason to half-ass that magic system if you put that in place. And of course, once the magic system is in place, we need to decide if our magic system and our physics engine are in conflict, and in the examples I've given, they wouldn't be. This race would probably be able to live on this planet just fine. We're gonna say they were native to this planet, and humans showed up here after the fact, so though that magic system on that planet works out fine. So examples out of the way, let's run through my steps for making, solidifying, and unifying rules. Number 1, first we make rules and flesh them out. You take every rule you make and you run it through to its logical conclusion. If you up the gravity, animals are going to be smaller. Joints are going to be more easily injured. Things are going to be heavier. It's going to be harder to escape the atmosphere. You got to think about all the ramifications of a change you make so that you can evenly apply it and so that it affects the next rule you make properly. And step number 2 is to simply do that process once all of your rules are in place. Once you've picked and made every rule, make sure your entire rule system has affected your world in a seamless, logical, consistent way. Apply the changes throughout the world and make sure they all interact properly and you've run through all the possibilities. That's step 2. 3, you need to apply those rules to the biosphere. If you make big changes to the planet or the physics of the planet, you need to make sure you affect the animals in logical, consistent ways. Step 4, you apply your physics to your story and make sure they don't get in the way of your story and your story doesn't clash against your physics. If they clash, you need to adjust one or the other or both until they mesh. Step 5 is repeat 1 through 4 for your magic system. And step 6 is to simply run through all of your changes, your physics engine, your magic system, your whole way your world functions, and make sure it augments your story. Make sure it's serving to complement and enhance your story and not bog it down. If your protagonist is so daunted by the increased gravity of your world that he can't move, that's going to be a really lame ass story. Man vs. Gravity is a boring read. If your gravity is just intense enough to where escape velocity is now impossible and your story is about aliens attacking Earth, now your story is being augmented by that change in physics. An alien invasion plot would definitely be enhanced and augmented by the fact that humans never made it to space. So guys, this video acts as a direct follow-up to my previous videos on the subject, and there will be more to come. I'm going to continue beating this dead horse until you have a very thorough map of how I build my worlds and all of my core techniques and the way I think about world building. And I really want this to be a fleshed out, helpful series for you guys so that anyone who's building a fantasy or sci-fi world has the core tools they need to get the rough idea for their world hammered out, smoothed out into a usable world that they can seamlessly place their story into. That's my goal with this series. So if you have any specific questions, if you have anything that's not clear and you want me to elaborate, drop it in the comments. You know, if you follow my channel, I answer comments and I make videos about them if I feel they're that important. In the meantime, like, share, subscribe, hit the damn bell. Help me get over 1,000 subs so that I can get access to all those nifty creator tools YouTube has. And in the meantime, be well, my friends. See you next time.